subject over a long period of time. With that in mind, let me invite. Are you going to talk together or separate?
We'll do a
Okay.
double act. I can
Okay, we'll invite Isam and Abel to make their presentation, and then hopefully we'll have after Ashik's comments, we'll have an open discussion and interactive discussion on the subject. So welcome to you all, and Isam, rolling on yours.
Before we start, a group picture, just to take a collective picture.
Feel free, this is an informal gathering.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Some.
Thank you.
Okay.
Wait, okay, so we'll keep this quite informal, and please stop us and ask questions, and we'll try to make it interactive and informal. This is unprepared. We have not really prepared, but what we'll do is we'll give a little bit of a very quick overview of the theoretical background of what is central bank independence, what came about very quickly. But what we'll get into, which is more interesting, is the story of what is happening currently, of the reform process and the political economy and kind of the trade-offs and things like that, right? which I think will be very interesting. And the reason I think we're having this conversation, of course, for you to know, but going forward from now onward, I think PRI and other kind of think tanks, research institutes will have an important role in really kind of making central bank independence work and making it successful, because it's a constant struggle. And you will see from the news, Trump versus the Fed. It is a constant struggle that never ends, right? So organizations such as PRI and other spheres are very important to inform the public debate, to hold policymakers to account, to come up with new ideas, and so on. Okay. Okay, we'll start. Next slide. Oh, I have the clicker. Sorry. Yeah. So, quick question. What is this graph called?
Phillips.
Yeah. So 1958. Yeah. Arthur Phillips comes up with this. He looks at the kind of the correlation between inflation and employment. Finds a relationship there. In 1960s, Milton Friedman finds the same kind of relationship for the U.S., which kind of and then this really gives governments pause to think, okay, if we suddenly increase inflation, can we lower unemployment? And for a long time, the answer was yes. And then, of course, you had the rational expectations movement in 1968. Robert Lucas comes up with the rational expectations kind of critique, saying that you cannot do this forever because people are not stupid. They will anticipate that governments are going to do this. But then you have 1977, famous paper by Catlin and Prescott, who came up with this issue of the time and consistency problem, right? Which is that, and if you look at the inflation above, you'll all be familiar with the equation. So phi is actual inflation, pi is expected inflation, and your actual inflation is expected inflation minus the deviation of unemployment from the natural rate of unemployment. Alpha is the strength of the relationship. So then, if you look at this, if you can push down people's expectation of inflation to zero, then what you can do is you can suddenly increase inflation and you can bring down unemployment below the natural rate, right? So this means that you can have a central bank or a government, you can have a government which says that, we'll keep inflation like low. We'll keep inflation low. People set their expectations. Okay, you'll have low inflation. Suddenly you lower interest rates or start printing money. Suddenly, people get their expectations wrong. And then you can lower unemployment, right? So governments have this incentive, especially to do this before election periods, or when they want to make a populist move, and we see this around the world even now. But in the 60s, 70s in particular, this was a big problem. We had a world of high inflation, and really central banks had a credibility problem. So then after Kidlin and Prescott, there was this whole move to try and increase central bank credibility. Okay? So like the way out of this was that you build central bank credibility and you really tie the hands of the central bank, right? So the central banks are not able to suddenly create inflation, and you tie the government's hands, most importantly. And the way that this happened was basically making monetary policy independent of government's influence and influence. So if you look at this is some empirical evidence that countries that had independent central bank between this is between 1962 and 1990. So Germany, famously Bundesbank, very strongly anti-inflationary because of its history of hyperinflation in the 1930s and 40s. It really created this, it built up this credibility that it would constantly clamp down on inflation. So then it managed to achieve low inflation, and then you have kind of countries which were Greece, famously, Spain, Italy, and so on. It suffered from high inflation because it couldn't build up this credibility, right? So their governments constantly tried to kind of play around with economic fundamentals. Then people got wind of it. They had high inflation. So then over the years, 80s, 90s onwards, especially 90s onwards, I think there has been a consensus on central bank independence. So we see more and more countries move to central bank independence, and we'll go into kind of what independence means and how it differs across countries. But yeah, it became, I think, so you had Latin American countries famously, going really hard with Latin America. Again, it faced a lot of very, very high inflation, problem of very high inflation. It went, and some countries, when some of the Latin American countries made their central banks constitutionally independent. So it became like the Supreme Court of the Election Commission, a constitutional body. Whereas in some countries like the UK, the central bank isn't independent, but the Monetary Policy Committee is independent of government. So the committee is legally independent, but not the institution. But we know in advanced economies, their institutions tend to work. These things are respected. So it works, right? For the UK to just have the MPC to be independent. But say, for example, the European Central Bank is, again, fully independent of the European government. The Federal Reserve is a bit of an anomaly where it's not explicitly written, and that's why you have this current debates and fight with Trump. It's not explicitly written down that it's a constitutional body, but the norm is that, the laws are pretty clear that the executive cannot interfere. But yeah, and this is how the governments around the world managed to solve, and this growing consensus. And the IMF played a very important role in really preaching this around the world, right? And really preaching to every country, this is how you manage to control inflation. Alan Greenspan famously said, "It was a great moderation." Was it Ben Bernanke? Yeah. But Alan Greenspan before that also said this thing of inflation has been solved. Of course, it wasn't fully true. Yeah. Yeah. So we have kind of lessons from so we have these lessons of kind of good and bad practices. So So as I was saying, Trump versus the Fed, this is really testing the limits of central bank independence. And we'll get into this for Bangladesh because what is written on paper, so the law, that essentially is words on a piece of paper, right? So what it really matters is, do people believe in it? Is it a credible law? Do people really respect the law? Because otherwise it's just word on a piece of paper. And then, we see in advanced economies as well. And of course, in developing countries, it's constantly tested. And then we had, kind of unorthodox economic policies. Erdogan in Turkey, came out and said low interest rates isn't always good, and low interest rates is how you control inflation. And then he also kind of dreamt up various conspiracies of the Western conspiracies. He also used religion. He said, Islam dictates that we have low interest rates, and that's how we control inflation. In Turkey, even last year had 70-80% inflation, right? And we've seen kind of Bangladesh's attempts at unorthodox monetary policy, the infamous
Could have added / Lotus Kamal economics.
the Noy Choi monetary policy we've seen in Bangladesh, again, trying to do unorthodox things. And then we've seen kind of the good, examples of how monetary policy can be very effective when the central bank is very credible, has a lot of credibility, and it's known, everyone trusts that it is independent, right? So the saying is, for credible central banks speak a lot and do very little. So it's the exact opposite of what your grandparents or parents might have told you, right? So they say things, but they don't, and the weight of their words is so powerful and so impactful that they don't really need to change policy. So famously, when if you had the global financial crisis and the issues in Europe, Mario Draghi came to London, and in a speech he said, "We will do whatever, the European Central Bank will do whatever it takes to save the economy," and that really had an enormous effect. They didn't actually have to do anything, so that really helped calm down the markets. The markets were expecting Europe to completely crash. So just one sentence, and this was a famous sentence: "We will do whatever it takes." And then, the Latin American example, they went the other way. They had to prove, Latin America had to prove that they were serious. So the likes of Chile, Brazil, Mexico, they made their central banks constitutionally independent. Some of the countries did it as well, but it didn't work as well. Argentina, Bolivia, Venezuela, but they're still struggling. So there's a lot of evidence around the world of what's happened, lot of examples that you can borrow. So I will kind of start. So we'll go into a little bit on what do we mean by central bank independence, the various dimensions, and then we'll go into what's been happening in Bangladesh and how we got involved. So that's more of a story, right? So there's various dimensions, as I was saying, of central bank independence. So one, the most important one in economics is monetary policy independence, and this is what all of the economic theory has been about, the theory, the practice. So in academic economics, it's been all about monetary policy independence. And there is two main kinds of independence. So one is goal independence, the other is instrument independence. So in some countries, the government or the parliament sets the interest target, the goal, right? So that, the inflation target or the inflation goal, right? So, and it's set by the government. So in the UK, the government has set the inflation target to be 2%. So it's a government's choice. In Europe, the ECB also, the European government has also set an inflation target. But in some other countries, so especially in Latin America, it's the central bank which itself sets its own goal, right? So, and in some countries, central banks have two mandates. Like they have a dual mandate. So the Federal Reserve, it has a dual mandate of both the low inflation and low unemployment, right? So they have a dual, and these, as you can tell from the Phillips curve, the dual mandate can clash or can conflict with each other. So they have to maintain a fine line between that. right? So, and the reason for why some countries have where the government sets the goal is to do with democratic accountability, right? So you would want the inflation goal to be based on the preferences of society, right? So in some countries, society, in some countries like Bangladesh or India or others, society may be willing to tolerate a bit of higher inflation, right? So like a 2% inflation target won't really work for a country like Bangladesh. And you would want that to be, the government to come up with that kind of set that, because, in theory, the government should reflect the preference of society. So if you suddenly have a, German central banker come in and become the head of Bangladesh Bank and say, no, it should be 2% like in Europe, it won't really work. So then this question of democratic accountability. But then, and in cases where, like in the UK, the government sets the goal, the central bank has instrument independence, right? So it can choose how it achieves that goal. So the Monetary Policy Committee in the UK is independent, fully independent of government. It can choose the interest rates. The exchange rate is floating, so that's not an instrument that they have, but their only instrument or the main instrument is the policy rate, and it can set the policy rate, and that's what it does. And and the government can, the government can't really change the inflation target, every few months, because that would affect the credibility. So it does it, I think, every couple of years. And then, other elements of it, so there's this issue of personnel independence. So this is the appointment and dismissal of the governor. So this is again being tested in the US now with Trump trying to fire Powell, the the governor, the president of the Federal Reserve. And so this is important because, again, like you can give the governor independence, the Monetary Policy Committee independence, but then if the government can fire them at will and appoint their own people, then that won't work, right? So that's another important element. And then financial independence is important, especially in a country like Bangladesh, because at the moment, like Bangladesh Bank is the richest organization in the country in terms of, and the most profitable organization in the country. It makes profits of how much? Like about
20,000 crores.
20,000 crores, right? So 1.8 billion US dollar. No other company in Bangladesh comes close to this. But
I just check it. You pull up a chair. Just pull up a chair.
so Bangladesh Bank makes profits of 20,000 crores. But as we found out a year ago, it didn't have the money to buy 17 laptops. So it was looking around for money to buy 17 laptops. Asking us, can you pay for 17 laptops? And why is that? Because it has to give away that money to the government, right, to the treasury, and then it has to ask for money from the treasury, from the finance ministry, that okay, give us the money, and give us the money, and then they have annual budgets, right? So their budget for the year is fixed. So then they cannot make 3-year, 5-year plans, and the budget is fixed and locked, so you can't move across line items and so on. So financial independence, particularly for the developing country, is particularly important. And also, again, for Bangladesh, something that is really important is regulatory independence, right? Because we know the big issue in Bangladesh, as opposed to many other countries, is really the issue of regulation of banks, right? And this is less, I guess, within economics, academic economics. This is less research, because I guess it's less of a problem that you have issues around bank licensing, issues around bank regulation, where there is government interference in bank licensing and bank regulation. But for Bangladesh, it is very important, and especially given the dual role in Bangladesh, where finance ministry has a say on regulating state-owned banks. But we of course know also that the prime minister's office previously did in terms of interfering with the central bank. And then just to go and break de jure versus de facto independence, which is like independence on paper versus actual independence. And actual independence has to do with how the society really, the trust in society, the credibility of laws, credibility of the government, and everyday practice, right? And this is where again, like think tanks will play an important role and play an important role in countries. Think tanks, parliaments, civil society, they really play an important role in constantly acting as a watchdog to ensure central bank independence. So, okay, I will that's the background to the story. We'll get into the more interesting stuff, which is about Bangladesh. I'll start and then I'll get Nofel to continue on the story. So, just to give you background, so in Bangladesh, you know the context of what has happened over the last 5-7 years. So I won't go into that, but we have the law in terms of the Bangladesh Bank Order 1972. It was a presidential order, and that really conceives of the central bank as a agriculture and industrial development bank. So these concepts of price stability, of financial stability, all these of controlling inflation, that's not really in the law at all, right? And the law, as it stands, gives the central bank autonomy. So it has operational autonomy. So it can operate as it wants, but it doesn't have the policy level independence and explicit policy independence. So that's what the interim government inherited. So you have your very own Dr. Hassan Mansour, who was appointed as the governor. So this is going into the story of how we got involved, and so about a week into his appointment, we made an appointment to meet him. We had an informal meeting over dinner. Duncan Overfield, who some of you know, him and I, we had a meeting with him. We had this conversation initially about the banking sector, that there's a banking crisis, and we said, okay, how can we help? We know this is very complex. Can we help? And that's how the collaboration started. And that's a story for another day. How we, the story of the banking crisis, the bank resolution. But then a few months down the line, Bangladesh Bank, they set up 3 task forces. So Task Force 1 is the task force that's working on banking stability, bank resolution. They set up a Task Force 2 initially on central bank internal reforms and restructuring, and how to make bank supervision stronger. That was initially, and they made Task Force 3, which is on stolen assets and stolen asset recovery. So a few months down the line, we're working with Task Force 1, and then we are in conversations around this, and we had this conversation with the governor that, okay, you're doing internal restructuring, reorganization, and he immediately said, yes, that's not enough. We need central bank independence. And we said, okay, we can help. So one of the first things, so we met at the time, and he gave the responsibility Task Force 2. And Task Force 2 at that time was essentially one person. It was this person called Mr. Sabit Siddiq. Mr. Sabit Siddiq is a former staff of the Federal Reserve in the UK. He happened to be in the US. In the US, he was a former Federal Bank staffer. He happened to be in Bangladesh, and he happened to meet someone from USAID while playing tennis. And said, "I'm from I've experience at the Federal Reserve. I can help." So he got involved. And actually, this is an interesting story where a lot of people currently working with Bangladesh Bank on all of these reforms, external people, they got involved by accident, right? So these were a lot of people that came in and said, "I want to help." So this is a really ragtag, kind of bunch of people, or some of them retired people coming in and working and saying, "I want to help. Okay, I have this experience. Okay, come and start working." So several people currently involved are like this. So I had this conversation with Mr. Sabit Siddiq. There's also Mr. Maria Hassan, currently the chairman of BRAC Bank, who was leading Task Force 1. So we spoke to them about, and explained to them, because they weren't really they were practitioners, they weren't really that well acquainted with central bank independence. So when we spoke to them, yeah, they didn't have that much knowledge on it. So one of the first things we did, so Nofel had just joined, I think at that time. So Nofel and I wrote this paper, the note we shared with you, which you might have seen. We shared this note with them, with all of Bangladesh Bank on, this is just very basics of what central bank independence means, what are the various aspects of it, and then various options, and then importantly, various choices that had to be made. So there were these we have in the beginning of the note, these 7 or 8 choices that ideally the government needs to make on these various aspects of independence. So, these questions of goal independence versus instrument independence, this question of who appoints the governor, how is the government, do you get financial autonomy? Will Bangladesh Bank continue to issue bonds on behalf of the government? Because that's one of the ways that money printing happened in the last few years, right? So to prevent, do they need to continue? Will they continue to do that? So all of these questions, and then so that helped kind of inform the conversation. That galvanized people's mind. We also got a team very quickly. We managed to get a team of international experts with central bank experts, former IMF staff, one of your own directors, Dr. Shamsuddin Tarek. He is the team leader currently working. We have Simon Gray, formerly from the IMF and the Bank of England, Fisher, again senior official at the Bank of England, working on the reforms. And we have and we'll stick to this because there's another team working on the internal restructuring. And then we got into the drafting, and I'll kind of hand over to Nofel to tell a little bit about kind of the trade-offs, the conversations, the debates that we had while drafting, and then some of the drama that's happened afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. So Nafal Wahid there. So I think I'll just jump straight into it, right? So when so this is sort of going back to around April, May, right? So about 6 months ago. When we started working and we put this team together, kind of around the same time, we came to know that the IMF is also involved in this one, and they're obviously a very important stakeholder. So the IMF sent a technical mission down to Dhaka around June or July, with obviously drawing on their own people from their monetary and capital affairs department, I think that's what it's called, which was then did a full sort of technical mission on advising the central bank on the legislation, and that team, along with Saad Siddiq and the task force that he was leading, went about actually drafting the first or the first draft of the new Bangladesh Bank Act. Let's call it the Act. And it was really after the first draft had been created that we got involved, or our team got involved, right? And we came in, and our sort of initial reaction of having read that draft was that it does all of the things that it touched upon all of the things that Isam mentioned, that if this was a central bank in a developed economy, and you were writing a legislation for that central bank, that's what that draft would look like. But it didn't touch upon some very important issues that both look back and at sort of the legacy issues that we've experienced in Bangladesh, and asked, well, would those legacy problems be addressed as a result of this draft? One. Two, it then asked the second question of what Isam just mentioned about, given that we're a developing economy or a low-income, poor economy, and all of the institutional and political economy challenges that we have, looking ahead. So if you take a 10 or a 20-year time frame and you ask the question, what are the problems that I can anticipate in the next 20 years that we need to grapple with? Is this draft fit for purpose, or does it try to address those issues? And the answer was, on both accounts, the answer was no. So what was wrong with that initial draft. It didn't really say anything at all, much at all about fiscal monetization, right? So in other words, one of the big problems of the last, especially the last 7, 8 years, was that, I mean, we all know the story, right? That banks were taken over, the banks were looted. The central bank was then literally forced to print money to replenish liquidity in the banks. And then it was looted again, a second time over, and a third time over. So this ability for the government to dictate to the central bank when to print money, as much money as government wants, is a fundamental challenge, right? I mean, it's a challenge that goes to the heart of central bank independence. It's a question of the institution, the values and the integrity of the institution. It obviously undermines monetary policy goals, et cetera, et cetera. And then, I mean, we're not talking about, inflation credibility in Bangladesh. I mean, we're not there yet to really talk about that. But if you don't have an institution that is respected, let's say respected by the banking industry, then you're never going to get to a point of inflation credibility or credibility in fighting inflation. So we came in and we said, well, that's ground zero of the fight for central bank independence. The whole question of fiscal monetization or printing money. The second question, very important in Bangladeshi context, issues around bank licensing and bank regulation. So, and this is, like we've even had, like Isam and I have had very extensive debates internally, and we've also disagreed with each other in some contexts, right? So I mean, personally, I've sort of taken the view that I think a very strong central bank board is really important, right? Generally speaking, boards of central banks are not very focused on. I mean, it's not considered to be the most important element or one of the most important elements of the central bank design features, right? I mean, a lot more emphasis is placed on the monetary policy committee and the people who make up the monetary policy committee, how much independence do they have, et cetera, et cetera. But in the Bangladesh context, the board really matters for two reasons. One, in Bangladesh, the Bangladesh Bank Board approves licenses, right? And that's, again, one of the big problems that we've had over the last 15 years, 10 years, was that, the government or the government was essentially dictating to the central bank who will get a license, when they will get a license, how many licenses will be issued, and so on and so forth. And one of the tricky problems with that was, well, you've got people who are appointed to the board who are obviously, professionals who've got day jobs, right? And they're meeting a bunch of times, 6 times, 7 times a year. How much, and it's a really practical question, like how much bandwidth and capacity would a person with a day job have in coming onto the Bangladesh Bank Board, dealing with these very difficult and very substantive questions of who to give a bank license to, how many licenses should be issued, questions around how do you manage the fiscal reserves of the country itself, right? And again, it's not just about, okay, we've got $25 billion or $40 billion, are we managing it as best as we can? It's one of the primary revenue drivers of the central bank. So when we say that central bank's the most profitable company in the country, that profit comes from buying and selling currencies, right? So you've got a person who, I mean, highly respected, highly qualified, but has a day job coming on and having to make some very critical decisions about when and how, foreign exchange policy, bank licensing, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the whole question in the Bangladeshi context of politicization, right? Can the government get to this person and direct this person to vote and decide in a certain way? And so one of the big debates we had around that was, well, on the question of bank licensing, should there be a technical committee of the central bank, not the board, but a technical committee? Let's say, you've got the governor and deputy governors and professionals, career professionals in the central bank, trying to make technocratic decisions about when to hand out and who to give out licenses to. But the problem with that notion was that, well, does it, if that were to happen, so if imagine a scenario where you've got a technical committee that's deciding that, and the board isn't involved in bank license. You could easily see a scenario where the government reaches even deeper into the central bank. So it doesn't need to go to the board anymore. It completely bypasses the board. The government is much more interested about who becomes an executive director in the central bank, who becomes a deputy governor in the central bank. And it tries to influence those second and third tier leadership to come up with recommendations and decisions that the government wants to see about who gets licenses and so on and so forth. And that's even more dangerous, right? So the whole debate was, well, do we try and insulate the professional staff from making professional decisions and leave the politics to the board? So in other words, you know, the deputy governors and the executive directors do their work objectively. They put forward recommendations to the board. And if the board wants to just ignore their recommendation and make their own decisions, let them. But in order to try and solve that problem, let's not give authority to the staff on licensing decisions, because the unintended consequence of that is that it would have far-reaching impact on the culture of the organization and a whole lot of other work that they would be doing, where you want them to be independent, you want them to be objective, and you don't want them to take politics into account. And it's almost an example of an occasion where we decided, you know, we're gonna have to let this issue slide. So there's no way to solve politicization of bank licensing by giving staff the responsibility to do it or to make an objective decision. If you leave it to the board, the government can always get to the board members and make them behave in a certain way. And it's a problem we can't solve. Let it slide. But the worst outcome would be, you know, kind of politicization of staff. And that we don't want that. So that's where we draw the line and say, you know what, so it's just one example. There's no right or wrong answer to any of this, by the way, right? You know, this is stuff you're just kind of thinking through, making judgment calls on, you know, it's very discretionary stuff. That's one example.
Secondly, the appointment of the government.
Yeah. So again, that's the other sort of very lengthy debates about the appointment process of the government. So what the IMF had said about the appointment process was it should be based on a double veto system. So meaning that essentially, you know, you want a second body, an institution, to appoint, you know, to assess or kind of vote, or not vote, but to have the power to reject proposals put forward from the government, right? So you could imagine a scenario where, you know, let's say the government's nominating a governor, and it goes to parliament, whether it's the lower house or the upper house of parliament, and the parliament reviews the nomination and votes and approves the governor. I mean, you see that in the US Federal Reserve System, for example. Congress votes for the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And so in the question of Bangladesh, how do you design this, right? And how do you design this in a system where kind of, you know, the whole, we know that there's going to be an upper house, and, you know, but we don't know how the upper house is going to be kind of, you know, selected or elected and so on and so forth. How do you design this? So the principle of double veto is fine, but what works, right? So eventually where, you know, you could have, I think, and this story is still playing out, by the way, right? So what the legislation largely says at this point, and then this is, I would say that on the advice of the governor, you know, this design is based on what the governor's expressed sort of position is that there would be a committee of experts to review nominations, review names that are put forward for the governorship position. It would have people like ex-finance ministers and ex-governors and deputy governors. So on that select committee, they will review names and they will recommend a nominee, which effectively the government or the prime minister agrees to, approves, And then it goes to the president for official confirmation or appointment, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Sure.
And you know, like when we were sort of debating all this, we thought, well, should this go to parliament, right? And I think that, you know, one of the viewpoints that came from the governor himself was that, well, you know, if the prime minister wants something, parliament's probably not gonna say something different, right? So so you probably don't need to go to the no, don't need to go to parliament. So but it is still being contested. So from what we hear, there is still a lot of pushback on this idea of having a committee review names and recommend names, and for the prime minister to simply agree or disagree. There is pushback that no, the appointment process should be led by the government. And again, you know, like there's no reason to argue, or there's no yes or no argument to that, right or wrong argument to that. And it's being played out, and we'll see how it works out. But I mean, you want to.
Yeah. So I just wanted to step a little bit back on this, and will not take too long. We want to leave time for conversation. So one of the questions was like, okay, so we were initially in this mode that, okay, and you know, all the consultants were in this mode as well, that okay, we know all of these things that happened. Okay, should we, like, let's put in rules for, you know, to prevent all of this, right? So okay, let's put in a rule on, you know, how do you prevent politicization of appointments and of you know, hiring and firing, essentially, right? So you put in the rules, but ultimately you can put in various rules on paper, but ultimately what it came down to, and you know, this is like, okay, if someone really wants to mess with the system, it doesn't matter what the rules are, you can mess with the system, right? So you can put in, you can say that, you know, the prime minister cannot fire the governor, but okay, prime minister can make a phone call. And as the governor, as the Mansur said, you know, no central bank governor in the world can really stay on if he or she loses the confidence of the prime minister, right? So actually, the wisdom of Dr. Hassan Mansoor was that, okay, there's no need to, you know, go into, you know, writing lots and lots of explicit rules, because ultimately the conventions and norms will dictate. So for example, I'll give a quick example. One of the things that I actually mentioned was that, okay, you say in the law, it says the government cannot fire the governor. So then I raised my hand and said, okay, but in Bangladesh, typically everyone resigns due to health reasons or due to family reasons. So should we also put that the governor cannot resign for, you know, these reasons, or, you know, will have that, even the resignation has to be approved by parliament. And then Hassan Mansoor said, no, you know, if this happens, you know, this will happen. Like, you know, this will happen regardless of what we put in. So the laws have to be drafted in a way that, you know, that assumes a level of good faith from the government. Like without that, and that goes for everything, right? All of these other things where, again, like, so for the appointment of the governor, there is a search committee, right now in the legislation. So then the question was, who appoints the search committee? Who chooses the member of the search committee? And so, you know, you can go on. So at some
point, the principle that we always settled upon was, whenever sort of debating all this, was that, well, at the end of the day, there's no law that's dictated.
Yes.
And so don't try and create a law that's dictated. But you can't, because it essentially comes back to that point that, look, if the prime minister wants something to happen, chances are it probably will happen. It's just a question of what is the reasonable degree of checks and balances you can build into that process, and that.
And the thing that, you know, if I can quote Hassan Mansoor, what he said was, like, it's like a relationship between a husband and wife. You cannot put everything down in a contract. There has to be a level of understanding. That's his kind of philosophy. Then we had some lawyers who said, no, you need things written down on paper. We cannot, if it goes to court, you cannot be, it cannot remain ambiguous. So then there was this, you know, tension between the principles position that Hassan Mansoor came from versus some of the lawyers, Bangladeshi sub lawyers, who said, no, you need to, if this goes to court, you know, you need a degree of certainty and clarity. And these tensions are still playing out. So, okay, so there's all of that. And I'll quickly end. No, I think it was otherwise, which is, okay, so all of this was done. This then governor wanted to take it to the Bangladesh Bank board. He didn't have to, he wanted to take it to the board. It went to the board, and then again, this is a very confidential document. This is not out in the press or anything. So keep it within this room. So then, as expected, we knew this from, and the governor knew this from day one. The finance ministry pushed back because then this is the political economy. They don't want to lose control. They don't want to lose their cash cow of 20,000 crores and also lose control of regulating state-owned banks and other banks and appointing the governor. And it came down to things like, will the governor be more senior in terms of the order of precedence to the finance secretary? Right, in Bangladesh, this comes down to individual level things, and the finance secretary and others got really angry. Why will the governor have a position equivalent to a rank of a minister, and all of these things? So they pushed back very strongly. This was expected, and months ago, the governor said, like, this is his fight. He needs to have this fight. And the thing he said, again, this is the political economy. This was like maybe 6-7 months ago. He said, I need to ask for 100%. Maybe I'll get 50%, 60%. So his view was, okay, let's go for a let's make Bangladesh Bank a constitutional organization, constitutional body. But then, of course, there is some practical challenges because right now there is no parliament. So how do you make it? But then again, this is being debated currently with the Consensus Commission, whether it can be a parliamentary body, the constitutional body, and whether the prime minister should have any authority. And we know that some of the political parties, you can imagine who is pushing back against limiting the prime minister's authority. So this is being kind of debated. And then other thing that has happened, and again, it's not fully clear where it will land, is that so very strong pushback from the board, from the finance ministry representatives of the board, because they saw there will be no, in the draft, it said no representation of the finance ministry on the board. So they really pushed back. And so for now, there's been 2 compromises made, it seems, for now. One is that one representative of the finance ministry will be on the board currently. But then the big compromise, it seems, for now, and we don't know how it will play out, is that the board said, why do we need to have an entirely new draft law? Why can't we edit the current order of 1972 and use that as the basis and then put in some of the paragraphs? So I think the governor wanted to, and this was getting stuck. So again, the political economy reality is that he needed things to move because there is not much time, right? This needs to be done in the next 6 to 8 weeks, because after that it will be election mode. So he said, he told his staff, okay, take the draft, the existing Bangladesh Bank order, and just copy paste some paragraphs from the new draft, and put it in. So they have done that, and then on that basis, the boards agreed to pass that, and agreed to send it to the cabinet. Now, as it happens, if you do a lot of copy paste job, it's not nowhere near perfect, nowhere near where you would want. The draft we had, and the draft we were talking about was really top notch, best practice, best in class. Right now we have a bit of a hodgepodge, kind of draft, and we haven't seen the final version because it was done pretty quietly. That one that went. And of course, the IMF aren't happy because the IMF said all of these things. So there were, again, questions of quasi-fiscal financing, which is the ability of the central bank to lend to various sectors, directed lending, money printing, all of these things are still there, which they didn't want. Things like, so it allows the current draft, I understand, allows the government, the central bank to print money if it's dictated by the government. And so all these debates are playing out currently. We are running against time because to get this approved through the system, it needs to be passed agreed by finance ministry, law ministry, and then go to the cabinet and be approved. So that's where we are. But yeah, there's a lot more beneath this, and we can go into this in the conversation in terms of the debates we had and kind of
I think what it does is gives an insight into the process of lawmaking. not just, not just policy making, but actually when you're dealing and importantly, the stakeholders, how they look at issues, how they look at the whole sort of institutional arrangement of Bangladesh and what their motivations are.
Oh, and we'll get into in the conversation discussions about staff salaries and all this. This is more interesting. It took a lot of color because they're like, and the position of the status of the deputy governor and all of the individual things that come into play. Yeah.
I think around that. Thank you, Isam and Noel, for sharing with us what I call a fascinating discussion based on facts, good practice elsewhere, and the political economy of reform in Bangladesh. I think that in particular, the political economy is very well captured into the realities of what we should expect moving forward. This is one example, and it's a very narrow example. It really doesn't involve the whole population. But then there are many other issues like trade reforms and all that stuff. So it gives a sense to this audience, which is seeks to do policy research aimed at implementation. And now, when we come to implementation, then there are constraints. Before I give to Ashik, some quick point, if you know the answer to that. One is, the Phillips curve has been, what is right since 58. It has been subject to lots of empirical research, evidence, and all that, and it has gone into many forms. It is not obvious to me that there is a universal acceptance that there is a natural trade-off between growth and unemployment and inflation. And in fact, lots of modifications happen. You're aware of the IMF or they summarize the research for development. So I think the consensus in my view, what I understand is at some point in time, we can be, I would say, double-digit plus. Inflation hurts both growth and employment and all that. There's also a short-term, long-term. So if you have any way of summarizing what the evidence, where the research stands on that, that will be very helpful if you can. Number 2 point is you made a very important distinction about the financial independence. I think that's a very, very important question. It is a tricky issue because when the central bank issues money, what do you call it, the severage, it's not a central bank income. It's a treasury property. And I don't think anywhere in the world the severage goes to the central bank. So your question of how central banks typically fund their, do they have an approved budget or they have the freedom? Because if you give them the freedom, they can print money and create as much income as they want. And that may not be, that incentive may be very powerful. So if you can comment on those two, then I turn to Ashik for the presentation.
You want to go on the financial independence?
Sure. So thank you. I think I'll pick up the second question first. It's a very critical question about financial independence. So I think, the reality of where the central bank is now is that they actually don't really have a budgeting process or a strategic budgeting process in place. They don't really have the good best practices. The way it generally happens is that, the central bank, from a policy perspective, it's a largely benign position. So they're making monetary policy decisions or FX management decisions with policy goals in mind, and it's not really, it hasn't, they're not really thinking about, what will it do for our bottom line? I think it's fair to say, it's important to point out that that's generally not how the central bank thinks now. But if you make the central bank independent and you give real powers to the board, there is always that risk. And you've got to ask that question, how do you guard against the backsliding against those risks that a really powerful central bank board will not be making decisions for their own benefit, right? And I think that there's no easy answer to that. I think on the FX management question, over time, right? Not now, but let's say, over a 10-year time frame. I think that's less of a concern because as the currency, hopefully over the next 10 years, if the currency freely floats, then the FX reserve quantum becomes less important. So let's say Bangladesh ends up with ideally $30 billion or $50 billion of FX reserves. That implies a certain degree of revenue, but it's largely captive. Senatorage will still be very, very relevant. And I think that's where monetary policy goes, the committee, the independence of the committee, and how the operations works versus who sets the mandate. Right? And this is, again, it is a largely unaddressed question at this point because the law doesn't go into this. Right? So currently what happens in Bangladesh is that, and I think we're all familiar with this process, that every year when the budget comes out, the Ministry of Finance comes out with, you could call it a forecast or you could even call it a wish list of, okay, I want inflation to be X%. And that's largely received as a directive or as a guidance for the central bank to target, right? So if the budget paper says a 5% inflation rate, that's a target for them. But none of this is laid out institutionally in laws and in practices. So if that convention continues, right? So there's a natural check and balance there. So if you could see that the Ministry of Finance, so if a board is printing money for senatorage income, the Ministry of Finance would come in and say, no, the inflation target or the inflation has to be 5%. And in order to hit that target, then you obviously have to sort of limit money printing up to a certain point. So there are these sort of natural levers or natural checks and balances that do exist to some extent. It's just a question of how these institutions and these stakeholders really how that interplay works. That's just on financial. I think I just want to make one important point on financial independence. We stressed heavily on financial independence, and it is on the basis in the hope. Hope springs eternal. It is in the hope that if you have an independent board that is able to decide its own budget and importantly set its own salaries, right? Hopefully it can attract good people, right? You attract people like yourself, very talented, very smart, highly qualified, who come in and over a period of time, they become champions within the organization. And that's what actually builds culture, right? Leaders build culture. And in order to create those leaders, you need to pay people well. And the hope with financial independence is that central bank will have the freedom to set market-based salaries that will attract people. And over a period of 10, 15, 20 years, that will pay off. There are downsides and risks which you've touched upon, and we'll have to deal with that as we go.
So that also links to the question of accountability. How do you ensure accountability? And that's like, typically, like the advice was to have parliamentary accountability, but we know the limitations of that. So the board will have to play an important role, but also like the parliamentary standing committee, and there is, or at least I don't know the latest draft, the draft we work on had a provision mandating the governor to show up at to kind of come to parliamentary standing committee meetings twice a year. So he would be called into the meetings twice a year, I think, and make sure they're drilled. And typically you will see examples of this on TV that happens in the UK and the US. Okay, so on your second question, yeah. So I guess I've not followed what's happened very recently after COVID, because again, these relationships broke down, and I've not followed the academic research. But one thing to say that the academic research tends to, on macro, as opposed to micro, tends to focus only on advanced economies. So there is, I think, very little research on monetary policy in emerging and developing countries, right? So that's again, something that's a big gap, and that's again goes to academic incentives in North America and Europe. But I guess there is regardless of where, what the Phillips shape is, and I guess, there's the expectations augmented Phillips curve, and there's the long-run Phillips curve, which is a straight line. So any money printing goes into higher inflation. I think there is a consensus on some degree of orthodox monetary policy. right? I think, countries that have tried unorthodox policies have typically had a bad experience. So I guess, this notion of credibility, I think is now there's a consensus on that. The notion that, you don't have anything orthodox, you kind of hold on. The problem, I think, happened was during times of significant turbulence after global financial crisis and after COVID pandemic, the central banks printed a lot of money. And so that was kind of uncharted territory, right? What do you do when things go completely wrong, right? And how much do you print? How do you roll that back? So, how do you unwind the quantitative easing? So all of these things are questions that the advanced economies had to grapple with. Slowly, I think Bangladesh hasn't had to grapple with this kind of thing over the years, but it is having to grapple with it now. And we see the difficulty that it is facing, right? So it's facing this kind of very big economic crisis, financial crisis, and the central bank doesn't have the experience of dealing with anything similar. They're facing very difficult trade-offs, and they're not used to dealing with trade-offs. This trade-off, not only growth versus inflation, but also questions about financial stability and how much, do you save the banks? To what extent do you save the banks? How much what do you do with the deposits? So these are very difficult, challenging questions that Bangladesh, had its period of great moderation from 91 to 2020. And it's starting to deal with this, and I think it needs to build up the capability, the experience, attract the right kind of people. There were also questions, there was a lot of debate with the governor on this kind of, do you have international members of the Monetary Policy Committee? So do you restrict nationality? So these were debates that were had during this process. And I think the governor said, okay, don't mention the nationality, keep it open. So it gives you that leeway. Even questions about, can dual nationals be the governor? Because Bangladesh, the government rules prohibit dual nationals from taking government positions. But, again, there's lots of Bangladeshis in the US and Europe who would potentially be able to play those roles. And I think it's still vague in the AI. He said, okay, don't mention it either way. But these are the kind of questions and kind of debates that we got into. It's really, very interesting.
So before, I'm conscious of time, but I think it's an interesting question. I want to put a different spin to it. Your question really was about the sort of where the research is at, or where the literature is at on the groups. I want to put a slightly different context. And I'll just say that, I come from a different interesting background of, policy to begin with, but then I worked in Bcash for 7 years, where I led Bcash's digital banking business. And so having worked at Bcash, what I had really insights on was the level of informalization in the country, or sorry, insights on the informal, the cash part. And I think that this might be I hope it's will be of great interest to PRI, that what is not understood very well in Bangladesh from a sectoral perspective is the sort of, to what extent are different sectors of the economy formalized or informalized, and what impact does that have on the monetary transmission mechanism? That's not very well understood at all, and I think it goes to the heart of the question. So we hear a lot today about this debate about to what extent in Bangladesh is will interest rates have an impact on, so in other words, inflation, is it demand driven, is it supply driven, are issues around competition, et cetera, having an impact on inflation, and then monetary policies arguably will not work if you just keep on hiking interest rates. To me, that's really a question about informalization, supply chains, and the monetary transmission, right? And there just isn't, I don't read a lot of stuff on this, to be honest with you. I don't think there's a lot of work that's being done on this. And I hope, and I would encourage all of you to really think about those issues in a deep manner. Because it just goes to, and it brings in some very important issues about the velocity of money and cash and how it flows and where it goes, et cetera, et cetera. And importantly, I think that if you take the rice economy, for example, right, and you compare the rice to, I don't know, vegetables, eggs, some other commodity, and you did a comparative analysis of is rice more formalized or less formalized? If it is more formalized, the monetary transmission mechanism should be stronger. But I don't know if we really know.
Excellent. With that, I'll turn to Ashik for your observations and we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Isambhai. Thank you, Naufal. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think we had a very fascinating discussion about both the theoretical relevance of central bank independence and the practical political economy challenges that we are still experiencing and probably will experience in the future too. I don't think the problems are going away anytime soon. Whether with the election or without the election, even after February. So I'll structure my 10 minutes into how I see the issue as an institutional economist, and then how do I see the practical realities playing out in Bangladesh. So the issue of institutions and institutional independence for institutions such as Bangladesh Bank or Judiciary or Election Commission is effectively a question of whether Bangladesh wants to modernize its economy and political system. If you look at the Douglas North literature, if you look at the Acemoglu literature, if you look at the Hajung Chen literature, all the discussion, the effective discussion is about what countries were able to break free from the shackles of poverty or the middle income trap and become an advanced economy, and which countries got stuck, right? And if we see the last 100 years, we can see only very few countries make that complete transition from rags to riches. You only have very few South Koreas and Singapore and Taiwan and Japan who made that transition over the last 150 years. In fact, after Second World War, only 5 countries made that big leap from that complete poverty to that journey to become an advanced country. And at the heart of it is institution. And institutions have 2 major dimensions in this. Today, we're talking about independence and autonomy of accountability, and the other one is about capacity. I'm not going to touch capacity. But what is at play here? Why is it difficult? And you need to, as thinkers, you need to ask yourself, why is it difficult for Sudan to copy Switzerland's constitution? Or why is it difficult for Bangladesh to copy Belgium's constitution? What is that problem? What is institution? Are institution just rules that we just copy and paste and voila, Congo becomes Canada? Does the process work like that? If it did work like that, why did not Congo try that? It was that simple. And this is where the far-reaching insights of Douglas North came in, who talked about institutional path dependence, which is that bad institutions, say rent-seeking institutions, create rent-seeking organizations. Say rent-seeking organization in period T will create rent-seeking organization in period T+1, who will ensure that the bad institutions prevail in period T+2, which basically means that chain will go on and you will create a system where rent-seeking is rewarded and not creative destruction and innovation and competition. On the other hand, countries with good institutions, say institutions that promote technology, creative destruction, competition, will create organizations who favor benefits from competition, benefits from innovation, benefits from technology, and they will invest in the good institutions surviving in period T+2, and that good chain will continue overall. So you see the divergence, how good institutions create good organization, who then invests in good institutions to make sure the path dependents survive. And then for the bad story, that the bad institutions create the bad organization, who then has an incentive to protect the bad institution. Now, the question of political economy is, that is where the challenge comes. That is why going from one equilibrium of bad institution to good institution will face political economy bottleneck from the old order and the organizations who benefit from the old order. Who are these organizations? It could be economic organization, it could be political organization. It could be that bureaucrat who's worried about his status. It could be about that political party who wants to do whatever they want while they're in power. So it is absolutely about motivating the organizations within the state of play to determine how and what kind of institutional equilibrium you achieve. Now, this comes to the question of reform. Then if the institutional path dependents are so embedded, how do you do reform? And reform is rare. You only get a window of opportunity. You get every 15, 20 years. South Africa got its reform after 50 years of apartheid. And boom, 2 years of reform and that is it. The reform window closed. Reform takes a lot of structural tension, a lot of political upheaval for the window to open up and the window closes down. So sometimes people say you have to be pragmatic, but during reform window, you have to ask for the 100%. Otherwise, you don't get the 50%. Without asking for the 100%, the political economy of compromise and consensus don't give you that 50%. But where I feel in Bangladesh, where I partly disagree with Hasan sir, as you know, internally, as you mentioned, and I had this conversation with him, is that he wants to go by convention and norms. And I understand that he understands if the prime minister does not trust the good faith, but I also believe in the power of the letter of the law. And why I talk about the letter of the law is because of this, and I'm going to use an anecdote. It is very difficult to fire the Supreme Court justice, right? And if you really want to do it, you can do it if you're the prime minister. We did it in Bangladesh. But you have to make the process as embarrassing as possible for the prime minister. You need to make the process as politically costly, as socially embarrassing for the political parties in power so that they weigh the trade-offs. That, okay, I want to fire my governor because he's not printing money for Esalon, but the letter of the law does not support it. I have to send DGFI to his house. Then let him commit the DGFI to that house. Let him face that social embarrassment and political embarrassment, because that also pays back in certain way, as we saw over time. So I personally believe that the letter of the law is very important for any reform to work, because in Bangladesh, norms and conventions did not mature. There are no norms and conventions. People do anything and people get away with anything. People have a short termism embedded in their thinking. There's a goldfish memory syndrome. And therefore, in West, where norms and conventions are very powerful, unfortunately, norms and conventions have not matured in this country. So from the perspective of institution, I feel that the process that FCDO is trying is, of course, good. The Bangladesh Bank, that we are going for 100% and we might reach with 50%, but compromising on the letter of the law from a purely political economy perspective for me is very embarrassing. It will only produce suboptimal outcome. From the point of view of monetary policy independence and others, I think my personal academic reading is, in a country like Bangladesh or many other developing countries, fiscal dominance is very strong. Countries are fiscally starving. They don't have revenue. They have to go to the central bank for help or saving certificates. So that is a real practical challenge for any new government who would want to promote a bit of growth, and there's nothing wrong in that. So therefore, that kind of alignment between the government and central bank needs to come through a healthy discussion. And we cannot completely insulate Bangladesh central bank from the need of fiscal dominance, especially when tax to GDP ratio is 6.6%. And the last point that I want to make is the role of civil society. I personally feel, and this is a feeling that I have increasingly felt over the last 2 decades, that I feel that civil society has to remain over the next 5 to 10 years as it was in the past, the leading voice for institutional reform. And the central bank, the debates surrounding central bank, trust me, will not end in February. There can be two options for the government in play. Either they would be interested to close the reform window as closely as possible. If that happens, the civil society needs to speak up. Or the political power who comes will have to understand that without reform, they don't have long-term sustainability. And the job of the civil society is to communicate them as much as possible that, look, don't make the mistakes that were made in the past. And I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, but I fully note your point that the reform must be has some backing in the legal system. Otherwise, leaving it to convention and all that is highly risk, even in the context of, I would say more in the context of. So I would say that even though Assam may have pragmatic views, but I think go for good practice of having international, rather than modify to Bangladesh norms. I will now open up. Anybody can
I'd like
start.
to
Zaidi, I would
so
start first.
going to
Okay.
make a
Yeah, please.
small. It was fascinating to listen to Isam, Nofel, and of course, Ashik, the institutional economy. I mean, I agree with you all of that, and you made the final point, which I would try to talk about, and that's my only point about this independence of the central bank. But I have actually 2 points, but the one about governance, appointment of the governor central bank, this is a very political issue. It's not going to be settled as far, I mean, with an ordinance, it's not. So let me talk about the other point. What Ashik said about fiscal dominance of developing countries. Bangladesh runs a fiscal deficit. It's going to continue to run the fiscal deficit. And it runs the deficit simply because, no matter how high the tax GDP ratio rises, you see, Nepal has a tax GDP ratio of 18%, but it still runs a deficit of more than 6%, higher deficit than Bangladesh. So in the case of Bangladesh, it will run fiscal deficits. The good thing is Bangladesh has been maintaining sustainable fiscal deficits, around 5%, in fact, less than 5% if you look at the actual deficits for the last 20 plus years. So question is, monetary policy independence is related to the financing of the fiscal deficits. So if you have a fiscal deficit of it's roughly 5% of GDP, and roughly 2% of GDP is financed through multilateral aid and foreign resources. So you have 3% of GDP that has to be financed domestically. And financing that requires, no matter how much, you borrow from the public through these Sanchay Patru, you end up borrowing partly from the central bank, partly from the banking system. And that is where, monetary policy gets muddled. I mean, even the Federal Reserve these days, we now realize that the Phillips curve relationship does not hold. And what the Fed has been given now is not just inflation targeting. Fed has 2 goals right now: inflation targeting. The other is the employment management. So Fed is not absolved of the responsibility that there is for employment. So, and those are conflicting. So that's where, in the case of Bangladesh, so how can you have monetary policy independence if you have to finance the deficit? There will be at least 1 or 2% of GDP that the Ministry of Finance will fall back on the Bangladesh bank and say, you've got to, otherwise, how do you finance a development program? So you have to take that into account when you talk about Bangladesh banking. So I don't know how it gets resolved to these that you want. So that's the only point I want to make it at.
Just one point.
My view is this, about independence, there is no issue because a central bank should be operating in that paradigm. I just want to bring to your notice is central bank is part of the executive branch of the government. While we want independence, we should not be getting into a point which creates conflict within the executive because you don't run the government at all. Number two, political government comes in, any government, they have a political goal to achieve. They have certain points to achieve. It's a question of how independent do you want this central bank to become, that the political goal is this and central bank said, oh, you cannot go up to this. It's not going to work immediately. So when proposing things, we need to be very careful about what we are proposing because at the end of it, whether legislated, it was ultimately the political government. If the legislated, it happens. Otherwise, it does not happen. So this is something that needs to be taken care of. Other issue is this whole question of which is very critical. Who becomes the governor? Now, this question of search committee, and this was one thing driven by at that time I was in World Bank. You have to have a search committee for all these organizations. And government set up search committees. And look what they did with the election commission. So can we have a better way of that more, I think the quality of the person, can it be defined in a more year? Instead of what we do, that A, B, C, and you can put in anybody in the world into that. So putting in that format might be easier and might be palatable. So while we have to be oblivious of the reality.
I think just commenting on you and Zaghir is that this question of central bank is also an instrument of government policy. There's no debate on that. Question is, can that be done in a way that it does not conflict with internally conflicting? Right now, there is an internal conflict between, say, price stability and whatever other objectives the government has. And the issue is, can it be set up in a way that the price stability takes precedence? And the independence is only targeted towards that. It does not mean that it will be completely independent of the government. So to me, that is not a really what is the right word? A real trade-off. On the issue of fiscal deficit financing, I'm not convinced that Bangladesh Bank has to print money to finance the fiscal deficit. Government can borrow from wherever it wants. It can sell T-bills to whoever it wants. So USA, I don't think they print the fiscal deficit through.
Explicitly not allowed, yeah.
Not allowed. So that again is not really an issue in terms of, because more, in fact, right now the T-bills are the main source bought by commercial banks. Now, of course, you can design monetary policy in a way that they do not allow these T-bills to be in your reserve, and then there is no monetization at all. So, but right now this can evolve, but they are not insurmountable in my view. So absolutely, you cannot have a central bank which runs in its own way and the rest of the government goes the other way. There has to be some coordination, and the question is how that coordination happens, and in a way that it does not, deflect the central bank's central objective. That's to me, should we have inflation target? I think to me that is a policy question. Okay.
Anyone, any young people? Come on, young people, speak.
Anybody who is
Please.
have a visit from outside.
Asal, wanna speak? Asal, please.
I have a question. Very interesting presentations, of course. It was great hearing.
Jitbhai, please, just sit and ship on
Although I think we are a bit late because some other countries like Indonesia, South Africa, they have their reform windows much earlier, like for Indonesia. So I wanted to ask whether this would be enough to ensure de facto autonomy for the Bangladesh Bank, because we all know that there are other legal acts and documents that might be needing amendment, such as the Public Money and Budget Management Act, which provides regulations for certain monetization of the fiscal deficit, and also the public service and rules of business for the government as well. So there are some gray areas in those acts which which makes Bangladesh Bank maybe some sort of a lesser organization than it should be in terms of executive positioning. So is work being planned around that area or not? And yeah, that's just.
So
আরেকটা কোয়েশ্চেন বিপ্লব
একটা করে নেই
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা আচ্ছা।
আচ্ছা, একটা করে।
না এটা খুব ইন্টারেস্টিং তো এটা হচ্ছে যে স্টাফের তরফ থেকে দিস ওয়াজ দ্য বিগ থিং রাইট যে আমাদের স্ট্যাটাস কি হবে আমরা কি কিন্তু এখন তারা বলতেছে আমরা তো আর গেলাম সরকারি কর্মচারী না ওইটা একটা ওদের বেরিয়ে ছিল যে আমাদের স্ট্যাটাস বিকজ ওখানে যেমন লেখা ছিল যে গভর্নরের ইয়ে ছিল স্ট্যাটাস তো এটা একটা বিগ ইস্যু তো ওদের সারাক্ষণ স্টাফের ইয়েটা ছিল যে ওদের equivalence to civil servants. So they have internally in their head, they know the executive director is equivalent to a secretary in their head. Then so they have this equivalence. So that is still a ongoing question for them. And তখন তাদেরকে বলা হলো যে দেখেন মানে so the big incentive was your salaries will no longer be dictated by the government. It will not have to adhere to the government scale. So the trade-off of that was that you no longer have this status. So you no longer have the status of so they will remain public employees, but they are not bound by the Public Service Act. Because Public Service Act bound with the
Follow the government scale.
তখন স্কেল ফলো করতে হবে তো এখানে আবার কিছু we had very good legal advice তো তখন the legal advice was that যেটা এটা পড়াশোনায় দাও ওরা শুধু যদি কোনো ইয়ে করে I think যদি কোনো অসদাচরণ করে এবং অফেন্স করলে তখন they will be considered a public employee but other than that না
বিমান মডেল আছে না স্টেট অফ বিমান there are many other models যেখানে বিমান এমডি was paid 25 লাখ টাকা মাসে বিমানে পাইলট is paid 10 লাখ টাকা মাসে right so more than the prime minister of the country so there are many legal ways to get that
হ্যাঁ ওই ওরা যখন
Especially when you're in the same committee, right? Multiple committees.
তো যখন ইয়ে বললো একদম this is I quote staff said যে আমরা পয়সার জন্য আসছি নাকি বাংলাদেশ ব্যাংকে
ও বাপ রে বাপ
হ্যাঁ পয়সার জন্য
ভয় পেয়ে গেছি
পয়সার জন্য মানে পয়সা যদি চাইতাম তাহলে প্রাইভেট ব্যাংকে চাকরি করতাম
পয়সা এসালম দিয়ে দেয়
হ্যাঁ প্রাইভেট ব্যাংকে চাকরি করতাম আমরা আসছি status এর জন্য।
আমরা স্ট্যাটাসের জন্য
হচ্ছে আমি আর আমার বন্ধু বান্ধব আত্মীয় স্বজন একসাথে ইয়েতে ঢুকছি সিভিল সার্ভিসে ওনারা এখন এডিশনাল সেক্রেটারি আমি এখন এক্সিকিউটিভ ডিরেক্টর হইতে পারি নাই তো আমি সমাজে মুগ্ধ হবো কেমন করে ও আর এটা ছিল যখন এই যে রিস্ট্রাকচারিং এর কারণে যে
এইটা এখন একটা বড় প্রবলেম স্যার না এটা আমি বলি আমরা ইন্টারনাল আলাপ করি Asad sir wants to reduce the number of executive directors because it has আপনি তো চলে যাবেন আমি এদেরকে নিয়ে
ঠিক আছে
হ্যাঁ
Thank you. So we have learned a lot of things, but currently I'm working actually in this area. So debt decomposition, fiscal dominance, inflation. So my experience is that, say for example, already Sadiq sir mentioned the right way. Actually, so now this time fiscal passiveness versus monetary aggressiveness or monetary tightening versus accommodative monetary policy versus fiscal aggressiveness. This is the key question, especially when we talk about inflation targeting or central bank dependence or independence in this case. But in Bangladesh, the real, so not only the Bangladesh, actually, when I talk about the inflation targeting, so especially in which way we set, just like interest path, especially the which types of rules we follow. Say, for example, so many central bank set or follow just like Taylor rule adjustment to target the interest rate. And according to this, they say just like inflation targeting. But main concern is that if we look for the advanced model, especially just DHG model or cargo pricing model, they adjusted this to check these issues. But main problem is that how people react on the
Dr. Ishrat Hussain is here, former governor of we have a 5 minute update on what was done on the independence of state bank.
I can always announce
Free lunch, yeah? I have to speak 5 minutes.
So now you are in trouble with it.
I came to have lunch with you.
Yeah, I'm all are going there.
Please. So who is the audience first? Let me.
Well, we have, guest speakers from FCDO and British High Commission. Some, and they made a presentation on the independence of the central bank,
Okay.
in global experience, importance, and then Bangladesh.
They are involved in promoting the idea of independence and working with the Bangladesh Bank to develop ordinances and so on.
So talk about this.
So if you want to.
I have already conveyed my feelings and recommendations to both the chief advisor as well as the advisor of finance about the autonomy of the central bank. So I gave them my own example. When I was approached by the president to become the governor, I was at the World Bank. So I said I have one condition, which is that there will be no interference from the government and there will be complete autonomy to the State Bank of Pakistan. And he agreed. And what I did was to have a new SPP Act where the board of governors consisted of 8 eminent people of impeccable integrity and competence in their respective fields to be the board. And the board was empowered to take decisions on human resources, on technology, on banking regulations, on banking supervision, all aspects of the central banking. And the hiring and firing will be done according to the rules and the manual of the state bank, not the government. The salary scales will not be prescribed by the government, but they will be decided. I have left central bank in 2006, so this is almost 20 years. But this is now one of the best public sector institutions because a government employee of grade 20, which is the joint secretary, and the salary of his equivalent person in the state bank is 5 times higher than that.
Really?
So we are able to attract the best and the brightest from all over the country. So when I address the class of entrants in the newcomers, we find they are from the top universities abroad as well as Pakistan. And there's a tough competition because the starting salary is almost equal to that of Standard Chartered Bank and the Unilever. That is how you attract, and the attrition rate is very low. The second thing which I did was to divide the state bank into 3 parts. Central bank, the Banking Services Corporation, which was doing all the retail work in the cities and which was not very much technical work, but which was done through, tellers coming in, selling bonds, selling government challans and others. And I said, this is not a function of the central bank. And so we segregated that and created an independent corporation called the Banking Services Corporation. And third was the National Banking Institute for Finance, NIBAF in Islamabad, which was continuous training of all our employees who had a scorecard that these are the requirements to move from grade 2 to grade 3. And unless you have done that, you are not going to go to the next stage. Then you had a performance review, which was on a bell curve, which is a relative marking. 20% will get outstanding, 60% will get average, and 20% will go below average. So your promotions and your increments are dependent on where you score. If you are outstanding, you get 3 times more than the average. And if you are below average, you don't get anything. And then you have attrition process, and your promotion is based on your training outcomes and also on your performance. Then I inducted laterally in the joint director level people from outside, as well as provided opportunity to youngsters who had come in. And if they waited for their normal promotion, it would take years. But if they are prepared and they are eligible, if they have degrees and they have the interviews and the written exam, they can jump the queue and they can become joint directors. So there was no seniority principle as far as the promotions were concerned. It was performance and hurdle that you have to. And even at the senior level where there were gaps, we were able to bring in people from outside. I also instituted a PhD training program for any Pakistani who gets admission to the top 20 economics department in the world. We would finance that fully, and in return, you have to come and serve for 5 years. So if you want to serve 3 years, you have to pay for 2 years. So today, with the grace of God, we have the highest number of PhDs from the best universities in State Bank, and 14 masters from Williams College, where I went in and I established a program for training of the State Bank. Now people say, how do you finance this? We had a labor force of 12,000 people at the tail. The peons and the naib classes and the clerks and assistants and all that paraphernalia who were unionized. So we gave them the golden handshake. And the savings from that was able to finance these 1,000 professionals who were the core of the central bank. That is budget neutral. Then we brought in the technology, and the World Bank was very generous in supporting us. $30 million for technology upgradation project, the first of its own kind in Pakistan. So we have a complete end-to-end solution, all the databases, we have data warehouses, we have the banking solution, we have all the processes. There's no file, there's no paper. Everything is done electronically. So you don't have, all those rigmarole that the file is missing and we can't find the file. You have to be very prompt in answering because everything is there. So human resource technology, these are the 2 ingredients which you're able to do because you are independent. Nobody else in the government has been able to do it. And that's why their performance, and you can see the performance, which was endorsed by FSAP, which is the World Bank and IMF. They said this is one of the best central bank in the developing countries.
So we have a ongoing debate. Maybe you can shed light on that debate from the Pakistan perspective on 1 minute about fiscal dominance.
Right.
And how do you
handle
integrate
fiscal and monetary
policy?
We had a fiscal monetary coordination board under the finance ministry. And at my time, the fiscal budget was very much prudent. We had only 4 to 5% of the fiscal deficit. Right now, it is very high, and therefore, all the bank lending is going into the deficit financing. But that is because the government is not following the discipline. So that is not the ideal situation. And at our time, because we also privatized the banks from 80% government control to 80% private sector, the efficiency of the banking sector has gone up, and they are contributing 650 billion to corporate taxes while they were sucking in 300 billion as losses every year. So government is better off. The state bank gets profit, trillions of rupees of the profits to the government exchequer.
Do you have central bank does have financial autonomy?
Yes, absolutely.
You have your own budget and
We have own budget. We don't go to the government or anything.
Yeah, so, yes.
Then I think we had.
Yeah,
some
one central bank too.
follow practical experience of a developing country, so there's some lessons, some and where you may go to reflect on that. And if needed, I think we can get some information from Pakistan.
From you go to the website, everything is there. I think that will be no problem. You have everything on the website. So,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. আমাদের জন্য I think
Did Pakistan target inflation?
inflation target is given by the government as part of the annual plan, that this is what your target should be. And we have to explain why we haven't met the target or we have met the target.
Can the governor be fired
Yeah, we can
by the executive?
by not executive, the parliament.
Parliament.
Yeah.
So tell us something about the appointment of the governor. How is that done?
The governor is appointed by the president of Pakistan on the recommendations of the finance ministry and prime minister. And it's a tenure for 5 years. In my time, there were 2 terms of 3 years each. So I completed 6 years. But now it is 5 years, not renewable.
Not renewable.
Not renewable.
But is there a search committee or something?
There is a committee which looks at the possible candidates, both for governor and deputy governors. And that committee makes a recommendation to the prime minister and then to the president.
And how is the search committee set up?
Set up by the people who have been associated with the Ministry of Finance or the banking sector or eminent academics, depending on what they are actually looking for.
In Bangladesh, the search committee is appointed by the president, which is for election commission and others. President nominates the search committee.
Okay, very useful lessons of experience that you can internalize. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank
You
you.
are in a minute. Giving now off.
Gotcha.
You can close the.
So, if you don't mind, I have to go for lunch. We have, as you can see, distinguished guests. I think let me first, really express my appreciation to Isam and Nobel for initiating a very fascinating discussion of a reform program that is of high priority to Bangladesh as well as involves, deep-rooted, I would say, political economy. And I think the approach has to be a combination of international experience and some political reality, but embedded in as many legal, what would say, legal provisions as practical, because I think otherwise there is no teeth. And Ashik's point, I think, is very well taken, that unless if you don't have any barriers to good behavior for the executive, then I think you will. Because even Trump has, when he does it, it has to go to the Supreme Court. So I think that's important. I think so having the constitutional bodies or parliamentary bodies or legal system is very useful, because at least it has to go through. There is a lot of debate in the public system as well. I know it is all half done. We have lots of uncertainties where it ends up, but I hope something good comes out. So thank you very much, and you can continue with the discussion, and
We'll have lunch here and we'll talk.
Ashik, you continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Guys, you guys don't have to go. We can sit here and have lunch. We can just talk. I'm just arranging the lunch.